"You're just the temp, right? The slides aren't loading, the coffee's stone cold, and I've got a colonel walking through that door in 10 minutes. So make yourself useful, sweetheart. Or wait in the hall, because this is a closed brief, and you are not on my list." The young woman by the wall did not answer. She did not move. The captain had thrown the words at her the way a man throws something he expects to land, and they had landed on nothing at all, because she received them the way a stone receives rain. The planning bay was the largest room in the task force headquarters, a low-ceilinged space of gray carpet and brighter gray light, dominated on its long wall by a map that ran from floor to molding. Folding tables stood in a shallow horseshoe. A projector hummed against a screen that showed only a blue rectangle and a spinning icon. The air smelled of burned coffee and floor wax and the particular staleness of a room where serious men spent long hours saying serious things. A dozen staff officers filtered in with their folders and their travel mugs, finding seats, trading the low talk of people who work together every day. None of them looked twice at the woman against the wall. She wore a plain blue collared shirt, the kind a person travels in, and dark slacks and flat shoes that had walked a long way that morning. A visitor badge hung from her collar on a coil of lanyard. She carried nothing. She had the kind of face people forget on a train, and she was using it. There was a contradiction in her that none of them paused to notice. Her clothes said nobody. Her hands said otherwise. They were clean and capable and very still. And when a lieutenant brushed past her with an armload of binders and muttered an apology, she answered with a single word and a nod that gave away nothing. Not deference, not offense, only the economy of a person who has learned that words are a kind of ammunition and does not spend them on nothing. A clerk would have stepped aside and apologized back. She had not stepped aside. She had let him go around her, the way a post lets weather go around it, and she had not moved her feet. The staff settled. Somebody told a story about a flight delay. Somebody else complained about the parking. The ordinary noise of an ordinary morning rose and filled the bay, and under it the woman by the wall kept her quiet inventory of doors and angles and the small red marks on the map. And the only thing remarkable about her was that there was nothing remarkable about her at all, which is the rarest kind of camouflage and the hardest to learn. Captain Drew Halloran had already turned his back on her. He was 29 years old, and certain of it. The task force operations officer, a man who ran his briefings the way some men run a room they have decided to own. He moved among the tables, squaring folders, checking the clock, performing the small theater of a man with a colonel coming. He had decided in the first half-second that the woman by the wall was the fill-in clerk somebody had sent up from the admin shop, and having decided it, he had stopped thinking about her entirely. She, on the other hand, had not stopped looking at anything. Her eyes moved across the room once, slowly, the way water finds the low places. They went to the door and marked it. They went to the second door behind the screen, and marked that too. They went along the wall map, reading the grid lines and the unit symbols and the small red markings that meant something to very few people on the planet, and they stayed there a moment longer than a clerk's eyes would have stayed. Then they came back to rest, and she was still again, and the stillness was so complete that it should have told someone something. It told one man something. At the back of the bay, near the coffee urn that had gone cold, Command Sergeant Major Hector Salazar stood with a paper cup he was not drinking from and watched her. He was 50, broad and gray at the temples, the senior enlisted advisor of the task force, and a man who had spent more nights downrange than he had spent at home. He had learned, in those years, the difference between a person who is waiting and a person who is holding still on purpose. A clerk waits. She shifts her weight, checks her phone, lets her eyes wander to nothing. This woman was not waiting. She was holding a position, Her hands were loose at her sides, and her shoulders were level, and her feet were set. And Salazar had seen exactly that posture on exactly that kind of person, in places he did not talk about at dinner. He had been wrong about people before, and he knew the cost of being wrong in both directions. So he didn't say anything yet. He only watched, and he let the cold feeling in his chest sit there and tell him what it was trying to tell him, and he waited for the room to give him the rest. He set the cup down without drinking. The projector kept spinning its blue wheel. Halloran cursed it under his breath, jabbed the cable, jabbed it again, and got nothing. "It's the input," the woman said. She said it quietly, not to the room, almost to herself, and she crossed the gray carpet before anyone told her she could. She reached the table, knelt, and found the projector cable where it had worked loose from its port. She did not yank it. She seated it with 2 fingers, a small, precise motion, the way a person seats a thing they have seated 1,000 times under worse light than this, and the screen behind her snapped from blue to a targeting slide so suddenly that a major in the front row flinched. She stood. She did not look at the screen to admire her work. From her trouser pocket she took a small worn coin, dark with handling, and set it on the table edge, while she straightened a folder that did not need straightening, an old habit, a thing the hands do when they have carried a coin like that into rooms that mattered. Then she picked it up again and put it away and stepped back to the wall and was a clerk once more. Halloran glanced at the working screen, then at her, and felt the small irritation of a man whose problem has been solved by the wrong person. "Great," he said. "Now the coffee." The briefing began. Halloran ran it standing, a laser pointer in one hand, the visiting colonel seated at the head of the horseshoe with his arms folded and his face giving nothing. The slides advanced. The talk moved through phase lines and named areas of interest and the dry grammar of an operation still weeks from happening. And Halloran was good at it in the way that a man can be good at the surface of a thing without ever having touched the center of it. He spoke quickly. He used the colonel's rank often. He let his eyes travel the room to collect the attention he assumed was his. The woman stood by the door where he had pointed her, and she listened, and after a while she noticed the mistake. It was a small thing on the 4th slide, a grid reference that did not match the imagery it sat beside, and beside that a call sign convention from a playbook 2 rotations out of date, the kind of stale detail that lives in a slide deck because someone copied it from the last deck, and that someone copied from the deck before that, until no one remembered to check it against the world. It was the kind of error that means nothing in a conference room and gets a man killed in the dark. She knew the difference because she had lived on the wrong side of it. She had stood at the far end of a radio in the dark, while a sure voice in a bright room read coordinates that were 1 digit stale, and she had learned that a slide is not a picture of the world, but a picture of the last person who touched it, and that the distance between the two is sometimes measured in lives. So when she saw the grid sitting beside imagery it did not belong to, something in her that had nothing to do with the temp she was pretending to be leaned forward and would not be quiet. She leaned a few inches toward the major nearest the door and set it low. "That grid's stale, and your call sign block is last cycles. Whoever's on the ground will be reading off a different sheet than the one on that screen." The major turned, surprised that the clerk had spoken, more surprised that the words had the shape of something true. He opened his mouth. Halloran, who missed very little that happened in his own room, caught the movement and the murmur, and turned the pointer toward the door, like a man turning a flashlight on a noise. "Something to add?" he said, and let the question carry. "You read maps now?" The room's eyes came to her. She did not color. She did not look down. "The grid on slide 4 doesn't match the imagery," she said, "and the call signs are out of date." Halloran smiled the smile of a man who has been handed a gift. "Tell you what," he said. "When I want the admin shop to run the targeting brief, I'll send for them. Until then, stick to the coffee." A couple of the staff officers laughed, the easy laugh of people laughing in the direction the boss is pointing. He clicked to the next slide without checking the one she had named. It was a small choice, and it told her everything. A good officer checks the thing he is told is wrong, even when he hopes it is not, even when checking it costs him a laugh in front of a colonel. Halloran had chosen the laugh. She filed it away without expression, the way she filed everything, in the long, quiet ledger she had been keeping since she was 24, and she returned her eyes to the wall. Salazar checked it. He had drifted to the terminal at the back, and now he pulled up the morning's arrival manifest, scrolling the names of everyone the gate had logged onto the post since midnight. Most were nothing. One line was not a name at all. It was a billet, a role with the identity stripped off the way certain identities get stripped on certain manifests. Ground CDR, inbound. He looked at the line. He looked at the woman by the door, who had gone back to her stillness, her eyes on the map, her hands quiet, and the cold thing he had felt in his chest in the first minute grew teeth. He had served 29 years, and he had met perhaps a handful of people who could make a room feel smaller just by standing still in it. Every one of them had earned it somewhere he would never fully know about. He looked at the stripped billet line again. Ground CDR, inbound, and he began, quietly, to be afraid for the captain in a way the captain would not have understood if it had been explained to him slowly and twice. A young lieutenant, embarrassed for her, slid a chair an inch in her direction and murmured that she could sit. "I'm good," she said. "Thank you." She stayed standing. She stood the way a person stands, who has stood a great many posts, in a great many bad places, and has long since stopped needing a chair to feel the floor. Salazar stepped out of the bay into the corridor and took out his phone. By the time he came back, the room had found a toy. It is a thing that happens to bored, confident men in the slack minutes of a long morning. Halloran had a target now, and his target stood there and took it, and taking it only made the sport better, because a thing that does not fight back invites the next blow. There is a tax that the loud pay without ever seeing the bill. They mistake the silence of a dangerous person for the silence of a beaten one, and they spend it, and they keep spending it, because nothing pushes back. Every joke that drew a laugh made the next one easier, and the staff who would have been ashamed of themselves one at a time were not ashamed together, because a crowd divides its conscience by the number of people standing in it. The temp became a running line. One staff officer wondered aloud whether she'd wandered up from the motor pool. Another said the coffee was a real high point of the brief, best slide yet. And Halloran said, maybe they'd keep her on. And the laughter came again, looser now. One man did not laugh. The older officer 2 seats down, a lieutenant colonel with gray coming in at his temples, and a chest of ribbons that meant he had been somewhere real, had stopped looking at the screen entirely. He was watching the temp refuse to be baited, watching the way she stood, and a memory was trying to surface in him, the way a name you have forgotten sits just under the water, close enough to trouble you, too deep to catch. The woman watched them with no expression that anyone could later describe. She had a stillness that was beginning to make the smarter people in the room uneasy without their knowing why. "Since you're here," Halloran said, and dropped a thick stack of read-ahead folders on the table nearest her. "Make yourself useful. Collate these. Sequence on the cover, copies behind." It was meant to put her in her place, to make her a clerk in front of everyone with her hands full of someone else's paper. She crossed to the table. She squared the stack against the surface in 3 motions, fast and exact, riffled it once to read the sequence numbers, and set it down in order. It took her perhaps 8 seconds. Her sleeve rode up as she reached, and on the inside of her right wrist, a thin, pale scar showed for a moment, old and surgical and straight. The kind a person earns once and carries forever. An older officer 2 seats down saw it. He did not laugh. He looked at it, and then he looked at her face, and something moved behind his eyes that he could not yet name. "Anything else?" she asked. There was nothing in her voice but courtesy. "Yeah," Halloran said, pleased with himself. "Fill the urn, and then you can wait in the hall. We'll call you if a slide breaks." Her eyes went once to the map, the whole wall of it, the red marks and the grid she had read in the first minute. They went once to Halloran. Then she picked up the empty urn and carried it to the side table, and she did it without a sound, without a word, the way a person moves who has learned that the loudest thing in any room is usually the thing with the least inside it. She filled the urn. She wiped a ring of old coffee from the side table with a paper towel, not because anyone had asked, but because her hands did not know how to be in a room and do nothing. And the same hands that had carried 3 men off a mountain folded a paper towel into quarters and set it down square. The older officer with the careful eyes watched her do it and felt the wrongness of the morning sharpen into something closer to dread. If you have ever watched the young and the loud forget what the quiet ones have already paid, stay with this one and subscribe to the veteran vault, because the room is about 10 minutes from learning what it is looking at. It would have ended there, probably, in mere unkindness, if Halloran had let it. But a man who has decided he owns a room will eventually defend that ownership against something he cannot name, and the captain had begun, without admitting it, to be bothered by her, by the stillness, by the fact that the temp had read his slide and been right, by the older officer who was looking at her now and not at the screen. So he found a way to make it about rules, because rules are where a certain kind of man retreats when his authority feels thin. He told himself it was about security. That was the useful thing about rules. They let a man dress a feeling up as a duty. The truth, if he had been honest enough to look at it, was simpler and smaller. The temp had made him feel watched in his own room, and he could not abide it. And so he reached for the one weapon a staff officer always has within arm's reach. The procedure that lets you remove the thing that bothers you and call it doing your job. "Actually," he said, "hold on." He came around the table toward her, his voice pitched for the room. "Let me see that badge." She turned. The visitor badge hung at her collar, plain, the kind the gate issues by the 100. "This is a closed brief," Halloran said, lifting the badge on 2 fingers, as if it might be counterfeit, letting it drop. "That's a day pass. You don't have the clearance for what's on that screen, and frankly, I don't know what building you think you're in. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to hand me that badge, and you're going to step out, and I'm going to find out who let an uncleared civilian stand in the middle of a targeting brief." He slid her nameless folder off the table as he said it, off the edge and onto the empty chair, removing her from the table the way you'd clear a place setting for someone who was leaving. A few of the staff looked away then. It is one thing to laugh at a joke, and another to watch a man put a woman out of a room, and some of them felt the line move under their feet, and chose, in the way of comfortable people, to study their folders. No one stood. No one spoke. The bystanders did what bystanders do, which is nothing, and the silence of the room became, for a moment, a thing Halloran could mistake for permission. "Captain." Salazar's voice came from the back, low and flat, and carrying the way an old, non-commissioned officer's voice carries when it has stopped asking. "Leave it." Halloran did not turn all the way around. "Sergeant Major, I've got this." "You do not," Salazar said, "have this." But Halloran was performing now, and a man performing cannot hear because hearing would mean stopping, and stopping in front of the room was the one thing his pride would not let him do. He put his hand out for the badge. The woman looked at him. Then, deliberately, slowly, she reached into her pocket and took out the worn coin again, and she set it on the table between them, face up, where Salazar could see it across the room. It was not for Halloran. Halloran did not even register it. A bit of brass, a veteran's trinket. It was a signal, sent to the one man who had been reading her since she walked in. A quiet line of communication opened over the captain's head. "I see you seeing me. Hold." Salazar saw the coin. He saw the unit on its face. The cold thing in his chest finished growing its teeth. It was the unit coin of a formation that did not advertise itself, the kind of coin that is not bought in a gift shop, but handed across a table by a man who means it. And to carry one worn that's smooth, a person had to have been inside, all the way inside, for years. The temp was not a temp. Salazar had known it for half an hour. Now he had the proof in brass, face up on a folding table, and a captain was reaching straight over it without seeing it at all. Halloran reached past the coin, past the badge, and closed his hand around her arm. "Sir." Salazar was moving now, crossing the bay, and his voice had dropped into the register that empties rooms. "You need to take your hand off her. You need to do it right now. Because you have no idea, none, who you are talking to." Halloran laughed. It was not a steady laugh. "Sergeant Major, with respect, she's a no-show clerk with a day pass who can't keep her mouth shut. I don't need a threat assessment. I need her in the hall." "That is not a threat assessment," Salazar said. "That is me trying to save your career. You are about to find out," he went on, low enough that only the nearest tables could hear, "that the worst mistake of your life can be made in a perfectly clean uniform, in front of all the people you most wanted to impress, in under a minute. I am giving you the only gift you are going to get this morning, Captain. Stop. Now. While stopping is still something you are able to do." At the head of the horseshoe, the visiting colonel had unfolded his arms. He half rose from his chair, his eyes going from the sergeant major's face to the woman's, reading the gap between how she looked and how the most experienced man in the room was behaving, and not liking the size of that gap at all. A few of the staff officers had stopped smiling. The older officer, with the pale recognition in his eyes, had stood without deciding to. The lieutenant colonel found the memory at last and went still with it. He had read the citation years ago in a different country, in a tent that smelled of dust and diesel, and he had thought at the time that he would know the officer in it if he ever met her, and he had been right, and it had taken him an hour because she had wanted it to take him an hour. The scar, the 19 minutes, the grid she had read off the screen in the first 30 seconds. He opened his mouth and found he had no rank high enough to say what needed saying. So he said nothing, and stood, and waited for the door. Salazar reached the terminal again, and turned the screen with the flat of his hand, so he could see the arrival manifest, while he watched the captain. The billet line still sat there. Ground CDR, inbound. He keyed it, and the permission he had requested in the corridor came back, and the roll resolved at last into the thing behind it, not a full name. The system would not give him that here, but the operational call sign that the inbound ground commander carried, the one the schoolhouses told stories about, the one a man like Salazar had heard spoken in the past tense by people who thought she was already dead. He had heard it the way you hear weather described, second-hand after the fact, with the awe sanded off by retelling, a rooftop, a withdrawal that should not have worked. An officer who went back a third time for a man already gone. He had never once imagined the call sign attached to a person who could stand in his own headquarters, holding a coffee urn, while a child in captain's bars told her to fill it. Sable. His face changed. Anyone watching him would have seen it change, the way a man's face changes when a word he has only ever heard, as legend, turns out to be standing 8 feet away, holding an empty coffee urn. He looked up. The woman was looking back at him. She gave him the smallest nod. Just that. A fraction of an inch. An acknowledgement. The briefest dropping of the cover between two people who recognized the same country in each other. And for 1/2 second, the clerk was not there at all. And in her place stood something still and certain and very far from harmless. And then the cover came back down, and she was quiet again. And only Salazar had seen underneath. What the captain in the pressed uniform did not understand, what he was about to be taught in front of the only audience he had ever wanted to impress, is that the most dangerous person in a room is almost never the loudest. Subscribe to the Veteran Vault so you do not miss the moment he finds out. To understand what Halloran was holding by the arm, you have to leave the Grey Room and go back 14 years, to a moonless night in Kunar province, to a girl of 24 who was not yet a legend and did not want to be one. The years had not softened it. When she let herself go back there, and she did not let herself often, it returned whole, with its cold and its smell and its exact arithmetic, because the mind keeps the nights that cost the most in a sharper resolution than anything that ever came easy. She was a first lieutenant then, attached to a strike element for her knowledge and her access, the kind of attachment the manuals had only recently learned to allow, sent up the side of a black mountain with men who were not sure what to make of her until the shooting started, and then were very sure. The objective was a compound on a shelf of rock above a river that could be heard but not seen. The plan was clean. The plans were always clean until the first contact turned them into noise. It went loud at the breach. What was supposed to be empty wasn't empty. The element took the courtyard and then could not leave it, pinned from the high ground across the wadi by guns that knew the range because they had ranged it in daylight and waited. 2 men went down in the first minute. The radio she carried filled with the calm, terrible voices of people doing math under fire, and somewhere far back, a battalion commander named Driscoll was on the net, his voice steady, asking for a picture, and the picture was bad. She could hear it now if she wanted to, the way the net had sounded, clipped, level, men keeping their voices small so that the fear would not climb up into them. She had learned that night that courage is mostly a tone of voice. You decide how you are going to sound, and then you make the rest of yourself catch up to it. She had made her voice flat and certain on the radio while her hand shook on the rifle, and the shaking had stopped because the voice had told it to. There was one roof that covered the only path out. Someone had to hold it, and holding it meant standing in the open above the courtyard with the whole far slope shooting at the silhouette, and she did not call it heroism then, and would not call it that now. It was arithmetic. The path out needed a roof, the roof needed a rifle, and she was nearest the latter. She went up. She held it for 19 minutes. She would remember the number for the rest of her life, the way you remember a phone number from a house you grew up in. 19 minutes on a flat roof in the cold, with the muzzle flashes blooming across the wadi like a field of terrible flowers, calling her own corrections, putting fire on the high guns so that below her, in the dark, the wounded could be moved. She brought the first man down the ladder over her shoulder, his blood going cold against her neck, and she went back up. She brought the second man down the same way, and his weight was wrong in a manner she understood and refused, in that moment, to finish understanding. And then she went back a third time, because the radio operator had not answered. And the radio operator was a 23-year-old sergeant named Leon Vargas, who told bad jokes on long flights and carried a photograph of a daughter he had met exactly twice. She found him against the parapet. She carried him out too. She carried him the whole way down the mountain when the birds could not get in, 2 miles over rock in the dark, and she did not let anyone else take him. Men had offered. Good men, strong ones, with their own grief and their own hands held out. She had refused them all, not because she did not trust them, but because the carrying was the only thing left she could do for him, and a person will hold on to the last useful thing long after it has stopped being wise. So she carried him, and her back gave out somewhere on the 2nd mile, and she carried him anyway, and the sky began to go from black to the iron color that comes before any real light at all. It did not matter, because some weights you carry are already gone before you pick them up, and she had known it on the roof and carried him anyway. Dawn came up gray over the valley. She set Leon Vargas down at the casualty collection point, and she did not weep, because there was no room in her yet for weeping, only the cold and the count and the empty place where his voice on the net should have been. A medal would come later for the 19 minutes and the 3 trips up the ladder. It was a heavy, honest piece of metal, and it never once filled the empty place, and she had not expected it to. The gray room came back with the weight of a hand on her arm. Halloran was pulling her now, a step toward the door, his fingers tight above her elbow, and his face had the bright stubbornness of a man too far in to back out in front of his peers. "Let's go," he said. "Hall. Now." She had been touched without permission before, in worse rooms than this one, by men who meant far worse than a captain saving face. Her body knew the whole grammar of it, the leverage, the angles, the 6 quiet ways a wrist becomes a problem for the person attached to it. And the knowledge sat in her hands like a language she had chosen, long ago, to stop speaking out loud. For exactly half a second, her body answered him. It was nothing anyone could have charged in a report. A shift of her weight off the heel he was pulling, a drop in her center, the fingers of her free hand opening, just slightly, into the loose readiness of a hand that has learned what it can do to a wrist. For half a second, the cover came off entirely, and the thing underneath stood square in its own balance. And a man who knew what he was looking at would have gone very cold, because he would have understood that the only reason the captain still had the use of his arm was that she had decided, in that half-second, to allow it. Then she chose stillness. She let her weight come back. She let him steer her 1 step toward the door, a grown man hauling a woman across a room full of officers, and she let it be exactly the thing it looked like, because she had learned long ago that there is a kind of strength that spends itself in being right, and a deeper kind that can afford to wait. And she could afford to wait. That was the thing the captain would never have believed if you had said it to his face, that the woman he was hauling toward the door was the calmest person in the building, that her stillness was not fear or weakness or the meekness of the cornered, but the enormous banked patience of someone who has nothing left to prove to anyone, least of all to him. She let him pull. She let the room watch her be pulled. She kept her own counsel and her own balance, and the 6 quiet answers stayed folded up, unused, in her hands. Salazar was on his feet and moving. The visiting colonel said, "Captain Halloran." Sharp, a warning with a name on it. Half the room was rising now, chairs scraping. The older officer with the pale eyes already standing, his hand half lifted, as if to stop something he could not reach in time. And as Halloran pulled her that 1 step, her sleeve dragged up her forearm, and the scar showed plainly in the bright gray light, the long, straight surgical line on the inside of her wrist, and the older officer made a sound, low, almost a word, and went the color of paper. He knew that scar. He had seen the photograph that went with the citation, a young lieutenant at a casualty collection point, gray dawn behind her, the same straight line on the inside of the same wrist, and the picture had stayed with him for 14 years, because of the look on her face in it, which was the look of someone who has set a friend down and intends never to fully stand up from it again. He looked from the scar to her eyes and found the same look there, older now, banked down under 14 years. And he understood that the morning had been a mistake of a size the room was nowhere near ready for. He had seen that scar before, or one like it, in a citation, in a photograph, in a story told in a tent a long way from here. He knew, a half-second before the door opened, what the whole room was about to know. The bay door opened, and a hush moved through the room from the door inward, the way the temperature drops before weather, so that men who had not yet seen who was standing there nonetheless stopped and turned and felt the morning change. Major General Paul Driscoll filled the doorway with his aide a pace behind him, and the room came up out of its chairs the way a wave comes up a beach, fast and without anyone choosing it. 2 stars. The task force commander. He was 55 and gray and unhurried, a man who had spent his life learning to walk slowly into rooms because rooms arranged themselves around the speed he chose. The staff snapped too. Halloran straightened on reflex, his hand still on the woman's arm, his mind a half step behind his body, not yet understanding why the general had stopped dead 3 steps into the room and was looking not at the colonel, not at the staff, but at the temp. Driscoll had walked into a great many rooms in his life and arranged most of them around himself without effort, and he did not arrange this one. This one stopped him. He had spent 14 years not knowing whether the lieutenant from the rooftop was alive or dead or whole or broken, the way you lose track of the people who pass through the worst night of your life and then are gone before you can thank them. And here she was, in a blue shirt, with a coffee urn behind her, and a captain's hand clamped above her elbow. And for one human moment, the 2 stars on his shoulders meant nothing at all. And he was only a man who had once been a voice on a radio, looking at the person who had answered. Driscoll's eyes went to the hand on her arm. He did not raise his voice. He did not have to. "Captain," he said, "take your hand off that officer." Halloran let go as if the arm had become hot. Driscoll crossed the gray carpet. He stopped in front of her, and for a moment, the 2-star general and the woman in the plain blue shirt simply looked at each other. And whatever passed between them was older than the room and outranked everyone in it. Then he turned to face the staff, and he spoke, and his voice carried into every corner of the silence. "Let me read you something," he said. "Since it seems this room never got the morning's most important slide." He did not need the folder his aide held out, but he opened it, because some things deserve to be read from the page. Major Kara Whitlock, Distinguished Service Cross, Kunar Province, 2012. For extraordinary heroism, while attached to a strike element under heavy fire, for holding an exposed rooftop alone for 19 minutes to cover the withdrawal of her unit, for personally carrying 3 wounded men from the objective under direct fire, and for refusing evacuation until the last of her people was off that mountain. He let the page settle. There is a line further down that I have never been able to read aloud without stopping, so I will summarize it. When the aircraft finally came, she put the wounded on first, and the dead, and she walked out. She would not take the seat. She said there was a man still owed a ride home, and she carried him the last 2 miles herself. I know the citation by heart. I wrote the recommendation. I was the voice on the radio that night, and she brought my men home when I could not. He closed the folder. The silence in the bay had a physical weight to it now, the particular silence of a room full of professionals recalculating everything they had seen in the last hour against everything they had just heard. Every joke, every laugh in the direction the captain was pointing, the folder she had been made to collate, the urn she had been sent to fill. It all came back on them at once, and to their credit, most of them had the grace to be ashamed of it. The room had stopped breathing. "Major Whitlock," Driscoll said, "is your incoming ground force commander. She is the officer who will be sending some of you into harm's way and trusting some of you to bring each other back. She arrived a day early to get the lay of the place." His eyes moved once to Halloran. "Which means the officer some of you spent the morning ordering to fetch your coffee is the one whose name you will be saying when things go wrong in the dark and you need someone who has already been there." Attention on deck, no one had to call it. The room stood and stood straight, and Command Sergeant Major Salazar, at the back, came to the position first and held it, his eyes on her, a man rendering to a legend the respect the room had spent an hour withholding. Halloran's face had begun its long fall. Confusion first, the dumb blankness of a mind refusing the data. Then disbelief, a small shake of the head. Then recognition, as the name and the scar and the stillness and the stale grid he had laughed off all slid together into one unbearable picture. Then horror, plain and total. The horror of a man who has finally seen the size of the thing he chose to mock. He had wanted, more than anything in the world, to be respected in this room. He had built his whole morning around it. And he understood now, with a completeness that would wake him at night for years, that he had found the one person in the building whose respect was actually worth having, and had spent the morning ordering her to fetch his coffee, and that every single person he had been performing for had watched him do it. Whitlock let the silence hold a moment longer. Then she spoke, for almost the first time since she had entered, and her voice was quiet and even, and carried all the way to the back wall. "At ease," she said. "We've got work to do." Driscoll did not let it pass. "Captain Halloran," he said, "you are relieved of this brief. Major Whitlock will run it, since she is the only person in this room who caught the error that would have put a team on the wrong grid." He let that land in front of the staff, in front of the colonel, in front of the peers Halloran had been performing for all morning. "You laid hands on a senior officer. You ignored your sergeant major. You ran your mouth instead of your checklist. We will discuss the rest of it in my office, and you will not enjoy the conversation." "Step back." The colonel at the head of the table inclined his head, a small, grim confirmation. It was over for Halloran in the way these things are over. Not loud, not dramatic, just the quiet closing of a number of doors he had assumed would always stand open. He had not lost his career in a single morning. He had simply learned, in a single morning, exactly how much it would now cost him to keep it. Halloran stepped back. He was the color of the cold coffee he had complained about, and he could not look at anyone, least of all the woman he had hauled across the room. It would have been easy for her to let him stand in it. The room would have allowed it. A part of the room wanted it. Instead, Whitlock turned to the general, and her voice stayed low. "Sir, with respect," she said. "Don't end him over this." Driscoll raised an eyebrow, and she went on. "He's a young officer. He was loud, and he was wrong, and he'll remember this morning every day for the rest of his career, which is a heavier sentence than anything you'd write. Let him learn it on his feet." She looked at Halloran then, without warmth and without cruelty, the way a commander looks at a problem she has decided to keep. "If he's smart, he'll be useful to me." Driscoll studied her for a moment, the officer who had been hauled across his headquarters and was now, calmly, arguing for the future of the man who had done the hauling, and something in the set of his jaw eased. "That," he said quietly, "is why they gave you the medal, Major. Not the rooftop." He let it go. The punishment would be real, but it would not be ruin, and that had been her doing, and the room understood it, and would carry the understanding back out into the task force, where it would do more for her command than any speech she could have given. Some warriors spend their lives learning to take. The rare ones learn, somewhere along the way, that the deepest strength left to a person who has already proven everything is the strength to decline the last blow. If a quiet woman being underestimated and then choosing mercy is the kind of story that stays with you, subscribe to the Veteran Vault, and let this one find the people who need it. That evening, when the bay had emptied, and the slides were fixed, and the brief had been run the right way, Kara Whitlock walked alone to the far edge of the post, where a low wall of dark stone held the names of the task force's dead. The light was going amber over the rooftops. She found the panel without searching for it. Her fingers went to a single line cut in the stone and rested there. Leon Vargas. She stood with the stillness that had unsettled a room full of officers that morning, and here, at last, it was not a cover. It was grief, worn so long it had become a kind of company. She had come to walls like this one on every post she had ever served, the way some people visit graves and others cannot make themselves go. She did not believe the dead were in the stone. She believed only that the living owed them the trouble of remembering, the small inconvenience of stopping, of standing in the cold light a while when there were warmer places to be, and that the day she stopped finding the trouble worth taking would be the day she had no business commanding anyone at all. A step sounded behind her and stopped at a respectful distance. Halloran. He had come because he did not know how not to, because a man has to do something with shame, or it eats him. He stood a pace back and said nothing for a while. Then, quietly, "Ma'am, who was he?" She did not turn from the wall. "He was 23, she said. He told terrible jokes. He had a daughter he'd met twice." A long breath. "He's the reason I came up early. I always come up early. I like to know the ground before I ask anyone to die on it." Halloran's throat worked. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said, and for once in the day there was nothing performed in it. "I know," she said. "Stand here a minute. Learn his name. Then go fix your call sign block." He stood. The two of them, the legend and the boy, side by side in the amber light with the names of the dead in front of them, and the valor that had filled the gray room that morning made no sound at all, because it never had needed to. Some warriors fade quietly into the years, but the valor never leaves them. Honor the ones who carry it in silence. Thank you for staying and watching. Subscribe to the Veteran Vault for more.